Last fall, we secured a grant for a new research project called The Ethical Dilemmas of Digitalization, Vulnerability and Holocaust Collection. Stephen Aron is on our advisory board. And my plan was to talk about this project here today. But as you heard in the introduction, I'm kind of a busy woman. So I had some other projects to finish before I could start this one. So we're going to launch this project after the summer. But I'm going to talk about a little bit about it and the background of the project here today instead. But when we launch the project, we will research how ethical problems become embedded in collections that pertain to Holocaust survivors' stories through processes of archivization, organization, and digitization. And our project also aims to present suggestions for how these ethical problems can be addressed by reconceptualizing digitization as transformation by developing participatory and ethical archiving and digitization methods in order to make collections more accessible. And you have to excuse me here today. I'm going to read my paper because English is not my first language. And today I will mainly talk about one Swedish collection. Let's see how the Jewish Memories collection. It was created during the years 1994 to 1998. Today it's comprising approximately 400 oral and written life stories, 1,600 photographs and 100 objects. In sheer size, it is one of the most significant Swedish holdings of Holocaust memory, but also of Swedish Jewish heritage. And the Nordic Museum you see here, it is not a Jewish institution. It is like the crown jewel among cultural heritage institutions in Sweden. And its motto is to know thyself. And the purpose of the institution is to collect narratives and objects about Swedish everyday lives and traditions. And one way of being Swedish is being Jewish. But the Jewish Memories collection that was created in 1994 was actually the first collection created about and for the Jewish minority in Sweden, although the museum was established 100 years ago. And within cultural heritage sectors worldwide, digitalization is framed as a tool for democratization that guarantees and broadens access to cultural heritage and education. And during the past decade, governments and policymakers have become more ardent in their ambitions to advance the technology stature of the cultural heritage sector. Digitization has therefore become the strategy to increase public and citizen involvement in questions regarding cultural heritage. And in a newly published report in Sweden, it was stated that cultural heritage belongs to everyone and everyone should have the same opportunities to take part and contribute to our cultural heritage. And furthermore, cultural heritage is an important part of human history, should I do this? Thank you. And identity, and consequently an important part of society's foundation. In addition, this report underlined that cultural heritage institutions should collect, preserve, and make available material from groups that have been marginalized in public discourse, as for example, the Jewish minority. And that it should include these groups in the archiving and collecting activities initiated by Swedish institutions. Would also, according to the report, contribute to a more inclusive writing of history. But in Sweden, there are several challenges that precede the process of digitization, which need to be acknowledged and dealt with before we can digitize some of the collections. Many collections contain information or sensitive data that cultural heritage institutions either wish to or are legally obliged to protect. Furthermore, some institutions, like the Nordic Museum, consider their material too vulnerable to digitize. And in the research project that we will launch after the summer, we work with the concept of vulnerability, or the problems of vulnerability. And vulnerability is a complex concept that can be defined and perceived in multiple ways. The definition of vulnerability varies in and between disciplines, research fields, and national legalizations. According to Judith Butler, vulnerability occurs as a result of the corrosion, removal, or destruction of what she is calling infrastructural support, which is access to food, shelter, but also a voice in the public sphere, as well as through the creation of linguistic vulnerabilities. And Butler explains the latter by declaring that we do not only act through the speech acts also act on us. There is a distinctive performative effect of having been named as this gender or another gender as part of one nationality or a minority, or to find out that how you are regarded in any of these respects is summed up by the name that you yourself did not know and never choose. Connected to the linguistic vulnerabilities are the social, cultural, economic, political, and legal vulnerabilities that come about when there is little or no infrastructural support. As survivor testimonies continue to be a central genre of Holocaust studies, perspectives that pertain to how and for whom Holocaust stories are told also highlight problems that relate to vulnerability, digitization, and accessibility. And here comes Hank Greenspan has, for example, pioneered studies of survivor stories by questioning the very concept of testimony itself, contending that the act of listening to Holocaust survivors never involves the extraction of the truth from living subjects, but rather constitutes a dialogic exchange through which the interviewer and the interviewee find new ways of remembering together and interpret how the survivors recount the Holocaust through conversations. And although Hank himself do not use vulnerability as a concept in his work still contributes invaluable insights to how I understand how survivor testimonies or stories and collections are created. And also inform my understanding of vulnerability is something that comes to be in both the process of planning for a collection as well as during the collection process in itself, during the interviews. And I will now show or discuss how vulnerability was understood when Jewish Memories was created in the 1990s, and also how vulnerability was created within the collection. During the 1980s and early 1990s, a few key events helped construct an image of racism and neo-Nazis as a phenomenon that had begun to plague Swedish society. Swedish historian Helene Lööw argues that before 1980, racism was viewed as a foreign issue, a problem that existed in places like the United States or South Africa, but that was considered wholly absent in Swedish society. The perception changed, however, during the 1980s with the establishment of the racist organization Bevara Sverige Svenskt, Keep Sweden Swedish, and a series of violent actions undertaken by the National Nazi Party, both which garnered much media attention. And here I was supposed to show a very famous picture of the lady with the handbag. I don't know if you have seen it. It's neo-Nazis marching the streets of Sweden, and it's a lady with a handbag hitting one of them in the back head. And she is a second-generation survivor. But it's also ethical problematic photo to show. Both, I don't have the copyright, but also there are a lot of stories about this photo, and also the lady with the handbag actually killed herself a few years later. And her son says it's because of all the media attention she got from this photo. But it illustrates very well what we sometimes call the racist decade in Swedish society. So while racism was viewed as an international phenomenon before 1980, anti-Semitism is still considered un-Swedish and something that can primarily be found in marginal groups like the neo-Nazis or in some immigrant groups. These views have since the late 1980s and early 1990s become common sense notions about what racism and anti-Semitism are in Sweden today. Rather than understanding them as discourses and practices that permeate the entire social body, they are seen as specific threats that can be, if not completely thwarted, then at least mitigated through protective measures adopted by the government and social, cultural, economic, and political institutions. Therefore, Jewish vulnerability was and still is viewed as something that can be eliminated if the Jewish minority is protected from the deviant figures that threaten the minority. Rather than accepting that the Jewish vulnerability is dependent on many different factors, like anti-Semitism and xenophobia, but also historiographical and cultural marginalization, to name but a few, Swedish institutions view the Jewish minority solely as a potential victim of explicitly neo-Nazi and xenophobic individuals and organizations. And the notion of Jewish survivors and Swedish Jews, that they could be protected from the neo-Nazis and anti-Semitism, were also prevalent in the planning, collecting, and archiving process of the Jewish memories. The prologue to the collection, which is something that I have been worked for during the last 20 years, was an idea to create an exhibition in 1995 on the occasion of the so-called White Buses mission that Thor talked about yesterday, when Holocaust survivors were brought to Sweden. The initial intention behind the exhibition was to collect memories from as many people as possible in order to create a memory archive about Sweden during the Second World War. But when the museum decided to make the collection, the focus shifted onto a Jewish perspective. The idea only to focus on the Jewish perspective and not on the Swedish memories from the war in general was motivated by the perceived need to quell the sources that claimed that Holocaust never occurred and to counteract the perceived increased anti-Semitism in Swedish society. The idea was that a documentation of Jewish memories would be a very important contribution and a tool of fight against xenophobia and racism. Therefore, one could argue that Jews or the Jewish survivors, often categorized as vulnerable, were assigned a mission here. They should save a vulnerable Swedish society from a perceived increase in racism and xenophobia. And as I said, I have previously studied the Jewish Memories collection in different research projects, among one project about the history of the Swedish Jews, where I worked with 50 collected life stories from the category that is named in this collection, Swedish-born Jews. And in these previous studies, I was able to demonstrate that even though the Jewish Memories was initiated to create and counter what was perceived as a growing anti-Semitism in Sweden, the Swedish-born Jews were constructed as non-Swedish and aliens during the interviewing and collection process. For example, during the interviews were asked questions regarding their alleged Jewish appearance and manners, how they were acting like Jews, or how they understood themselves in relation to ordinary or normal Swedes. And previous research has argued that racial thinking about Jews and the use of anti-Semitic beliefs and stereotypes was an element in their creation and the mood of Swedish cultural and national identity. My earlier studies of the Jewish Memory Collection thus shows how this othering of the Swedish Jews continued to some extent during the interviewing and archivization of the collection in the 1990s. The study also demonstrates how anti-Semitism in Sweden was understood in the 1990s as something that belonged to the past, to Nazi Germany, or was practiced by specific groups in society, young, angry neo-Nazis, and not as a prevailing discourse or construct in the society in general. And here you can see an excerpt from one of the interviews in the archive. But this way of perceiving anti-Semitism and Jewish vulnerability also informed how ethical considerations were discussed during the creation of the collection. And even though I have not found any documents that specifically describe how the collecting and curating of the future collection was discussed in relation to ethics, I have identified a few documents indicating that the discussion about ethical aspects did take place. There are, for instance, copies of an interview contract and a form for informed consent that was drafted from the establishment of a Holocaust collection within the Jewish community's archive in Gothenburg. However, it does not appear that this informed consent form was copied or that a similar form was used once the collection was carried out at the Nordic Museum. Instead, all of the material from the project Jewish Memories is today strictly secret and is protected by a 70-year secrecy clause and can only be accessed in compliance with specific rules that the museum curators have drafted on their own and that are left to the interpretation of the archive director. And moreover, since the Nordic Museum choose not to collect informed consent, the archive director is also responsible for granting permission to access or use of the collection, even though the collection was created to counter voices from neo-Nazi groups and right-wing extremists. It remains inaccessible and more or less hidden from the public. The survivor stories and the survivors' voices are not heard in public. And what is interesting about these protectionist measures that have been taken with regard to the Holocaust collection in Sweden is that they in many ways defy a larger transnational trend within Holocaust archiving, commemoration and education, a trend that emphasizes acts of naming, individualization, transparency and digitization. Sweden thus stands out as an exception with regards to the protection of the archival holdings related to the Holocaust. And although several studies of Holocaust archival processes have been published in the last decade, none of the authors discuss the issues of anonymity and vulnerability in relation to collecting and curating testimonies and objects, while Australian Holocaust scholar Noah Schenker problematized the underlying epistemologies of the American Holocaust collections. Questions regarding vulnerability and protection of privacy are never dealt with. Indeed, it appears that the ethical and methodological issues concerning vulnerability that have been identified within other research fields have never been broadened within Holocaust studies. Rather, in Holocaust studies, vulnerability has been understood in relation to the ethical imperative to give and listen to testimonies. Following the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, Holocaust scholars have underlined ethics as an issue arising from vulnerability, about the recognition of the face, of the relation with the other, of seeing and hearing the other, and perhaps more salient in establishing a relationship between the survivor and the audience. Consequently, several memory institutions dedicated to research and remembrance of the Holocaust have made their priority to make survivor testimonies available and accessible to the public and researchers in line with the technological developments. In an international context outside Sweden, the collecting and digitizing of Holocaust archives has thus attempted, with the help of the rapidly evolving digital technologies, to make testimonies, documents and names available and accessibly, and to speak with Judith Butler, to provide the survivors with infrastructural support to tell their stories and to be heard. However, Swedish archival institutions have not been part of this movement. In Sweden, Jewish memories remains hidden, inaccessible to the public and to researchers without permission to study their material. The people who have left their stories remain anonymous, and their names, stories and testimonies are not heard in the public or used by researchers or cultural heritage institutions. At the same time, and this is where our project came in, the question may be posed: could digitization be understood as a method and a solution to the inaccessibility of this collection? And I think the answer is yes. I hope so, because I have a grant to try to prove it. If digitization is not perceived simply as an act of replication, but as an act of creation, radically transforms the nation's accessibility and use of the collections, and the material they hold. In today's presentation, I have touched upon how different kinds of vulnerability relating to being Jewish were created in the process of collecting and curating stories from survivors in the 1990s in Sweden. The problem of representation of Jewish vulnerability at the Nordic Museum's project Jewish Memories has been based on the assumption that Jewish individuals should and indeed can be protected from anti-Semitism and xenophobia by keeping their names, stories, and personal details concealed from threatening elements in society. With regards to the question of the discursive effects, this protection invariably leads to the entrenchment of already established perceptions of the Jewish minority as passive victims and the others in Swedish society. But since certain forms of anti-Semitism are pervasive and normalized throughout all segments of society, Swedish Jews live in a constant state of vulnerability and cannot therefore be wholly protected from anti-Semitism. This does not mean, however, that their stories should not be treated with care, or that survivors should not have the infrastructural support to speak about their lives and experience before, during, and after the Holocaust. And using theories and methods from oral history, I think we can solve the problem. And because the Nordic Museum never obtained informed consent from the participants of the Jewish Memories, these will now have to be collected in retrospect. And I suggest that the creation of a participatory digital archive from a non-participatory analog archive will provide a space for discussion and negotiation, as well as a platform for power over one's own history. And the museum can, together with the Jewish minority and the second-generation survivors, in dialogue, discuss and explore what is Jewish vulnerability and how they want this archive to become digital. The inclusion of the archival participants in the digitization process is not merely an act of supporting the right to articulate one's own history, but also a way of understanding how collection in archives as the basis of knowledge production can be transformed when they become participatory. In line with Jacques Derrida's now famous contention that the archivization produces as much as it records the event, I argue that the Jewish memories actually would change if participants are engaged in the digitization process. Rather than merely translating already existing material from analog to digital, the new participants, whether they are the original interview subjects or their descendants, second or third generation survivors, can help produce new metadata about the collection. They can contribute to novel insights on indexing and cataloging, and they can add new perspectives of whom the digital archive should be aimed toward and for whom it should be digitized. Instead of translating the archive, they would be transforming it. Rather than suppress and conceal their voices, shared authority and participatory archiving can help transform the analog collection into a digital space where survivor stories can find a place and be heard. Thank you.